Hi, I want to try and talk about private property. This is going to be a little bit strange because most people instinctively get the idea, and I don't, and I never have, even as a child. And I should, because it's a worldwide paradigm now, even though it began with Western civilization. Everybody gets the paradigm of private property. But I remember, even as a kid, asking my parents and my grandparents, my grandfather's greatest pride was his 160 acres. How can you say you own land? This land, it was there before you were born. It's still there, and he's been dead 30 years, more than 30 years. It's not in the family anymore. So how could you say it was his? No, he was using it. Possession I understand. Control I understand. But ownership, I just don't get it. When I would ask these questions, as a young kid, I would have this big question mark over my head, and the response from my relatives that I would ask this of was, what the heck is he talking about? How could he ask such a question? It's like it's ingrained in our very bones, which is pretty pertinent. I'm going to switch to something that I shot earlier and read a little bit about it from Fuston-Collage on the origin of private property, and come back and have a little bit more to say about it. I'm going to have to do more later because I actually have to return this to the library today. But what I had been saying previously was from memory, and I actually have the book here. So I want to read some quick passages, particularly pertaining to the right of property, which is derived from the early Indo-European religion, according to his research, and I think it's very valid. First of all, the idea of the right of property is unique to societies that were descended from what we hesitatingly call the Aryans. The Nazis gave that a bad connotation, but there were in fact Indo-European tribes that migrated to Italy, Greece, Persia, and India. If you want to use the word migrate, actually conquer would also be applicable. Now they had a unique ancestor worship form of religion in the early days, which we don't find in written history, because it predated their written history, but it is still present even once they developed a written history, and their greater city gods of Capitoline, Jupiter, and Zeus, and what have you, and Brahma. They're all from the same sources. Here's a particularly interesting passage. We know that there are races who have never succeeded in establishing among themselves the right of private property, while others have reached this stage only after long and painful experience. It is not indeed an easy problem in the origin of society to decide whether the individual may appropriate the soil and establish such a bond between his being and a portion of the earth that he can say, "This land is mine. This is the same as part of me." The Tartars have an idea of the right of property in a case of flocks and herds, but they cannot understand it when it is a question of land. Among the ancient Germans, the earth belonged to no one. Every year the tribe assigned to each one of its members a lot to cultivate, and the lot was changed the following year. The German was the proprietor of the harvest, but not of the land. The case is still the same among a part of the Semitic race and among some of the Slavic nations. On the other hand, the nations of Greece and Italy, from their earliest antiquity, always held to the idea of private property. We do not find an age when the soil was common among them, nor do we find anything that resembles the annual allotment of land which was in vogue among the Germans. And here we note a remarkable fact. While the races that do not accord to the individual a property in the soil allow him at least a right to the fruits of his labor, that is to say, to his harvest, precisely the contrary custom prevailed among the Greeks. In many cities, the citizens were required to store their crops in common, or at least a greater part, and to consume them in common. The individual, therefore, was not the master of the corn which he had gathered, but at the same time, by a singular contradiction, he had an absolute property in the soil. To him, the land was more than the harvest. It appears that among the Greeks the conception of private property was developed exactly contrary to what appears to be the natural order. It was not applied to the harvest first and the soil afterwards, but followed the inverse order. And the whole point of this is because of this ancestor worship. So that with the very early Indo-Europeans, or the Aryans that made these southern incursions, the bones of the ancestors rested in the soil. In Latin, they were known as lares and manes, household gods. Or earlier than that, I think the Greeks called them the penates, but that's irrelevant. The point is that there were each family had its own separate gods and worship. Now, of course, we're talking about the patrician families, not the plebeian families. That was a totally different thing. In fact, to the patrician families, the plebeians were little more than animals. They could not have a religion in any sense. So they were totally outside of society and really of meaningful existence. So the upshot on all this is that as time passed, the nature of Greek and Roman society changed, where the great masses of the plebeians began to demand their own, which they never got. But the idea of land ownership did manage, through legal finagling, to become possible for the non-patrician, the non-noble. And this is a concept that we have carried through from those early origins to today. And it is, in fact, ingrained in our very bones, for the most part. Never mind, for some reason, I just don't get it. I don't understand how somebody can own property. I mean, I do own property. You know, I've got my little house and my little front and backyard and a little bit on the side, and then there's a house next door and there's a house next door, which is fine. But, you know, I paid for it and I can sell it. I may not get back what I paid, or I may get more than what I paid. Who knows? But all I do is use it for whatever I want to use it for, within very strict limits. I mean, let's say I decided, you know, I bet if I drilled a well in the backyard, I'd get water, and I could get myself off the main water supply and not have to pay them anymore. Well, I don't think that would work.